Chapter 4: Why Multiculturalism? A Manual for the Proper Usage of Ethnics. Every year, Sydney celebrates its carnival. For 2 weeks, the city projects its diverse multicultural faces to itself and the world of actual and potential tourists. A quick glance at the carnival program clearly reveals the extent of this diversity. With its diversity in ethnic origins and in types of activities, from an international food and wine fair where you can eat your way around the world, to a multilingual computer games at Powerhouse Museum, the Carnival is a festival in which Sydneyism and visitors are treated to some of the best that multiculturalism can offer. This emphasis on what multiculturalism can offer is important, for as well as the obvious financial and tourist motivations behind it, Carnival is also constructed and used to legitimize multiculturalism as something valuable. As the New South Wales Premier and Minister of Ethnic Affairs of the early 1990s sees it, no other celebration in Australia has such powerful and distinctive themes, the value and meaning of multiculturalism in Australian society. For the Managing Director of the Westfield Holdings Limited, the major sponsor of Carnival offers the people of New South Wales the opportunity to celebrate multiculturalism and to learn from other people who have joined our society from other lands. The theme of cultural enrichment is one of the key themes of Australian multiculturalism. Its main emphasis is the recognition of the value of the various cultures present in Australia and the value of the interaction between them. This is stressed in opposition to ethnocentrism and is portrayed as transcending one of the major defects of the white Australian assimilation period, the unwillingness to accept that non-white cultures have a contribution to make the development of a more general Australian culture. Responding to an attack on Sydney taxi drivers supposing ability to speak English, New South Wales Premier Bob Carr said, "I had a good discussion with a Somali-born taxi driver recently about his experience with meditation and crystals. I was struck by the comfortable cosmopolitan air that he was able to talk and bring to his task." In this chapter, I want to show how the discourse of enrichment encapsulates a white national fantasy for those white Australians interpolated. As I will argue, it is not only its opposition to ethnocentrism, but the notion of enrichment appears in such an attractive pluralist garb. Left to itself, it reveals an important inherent opposition, the opposition between enriched and enriching cultures. For the white Australian articulating it, the discourse of enrichment still positions him or her in the center of the Australian cultural map. Far from putting migrant cultures, even in their soft sense, their food, dance, etc., on an equal footing with the dominant culture, the theme conjures the images of a multicultural fair where the various stalls of neatly positioned migrant cultures are exhibited and where the real Australian bearers of the white nation and positioned the central role of the touring subjects walk around and enrich themselves. The multicultural fair has, however, changed dramatically over the years. Initially secured positions in the role of feeder migrants have increasingly become willing to be touring subjects wanting to be enriched themselves. Any walk around a multicultural fair clearly shows this today. It is this reality of the ethnic feeder that white multicultural fantasy tries to block. The Stupid Group and the Anglo that does not stop. The Stupid Group is a children's book I used to read to my daughters in the early 1990s. Set in Victoria during the gold rush, the story is about how miners from different ethnic backgrounds combined various ethnic-specific ingredients in their position and made the Eureka Stew. It aims to symbolize the making of the Australian nation. As often happens with children's books, I was made to read this one a number of times. It was only after several readings that I began to realize there was something not quite right in the celebration of the value of cultural diversity that was at the core of the story. The book, far from celebrating diversity, or rather, in the process of doing so, appearing as a negation of white ethnocentrism, celebrated a white nation fantasy in which white Australians, in this case an Anglo-Celtic couple, where the Anglo-male had supremacy, enacted their capacity to manage this diversity. As I critically examine this book, I will analyze how the structure, the themes, and the images of ethnicity, ethnic relations contained within the white fantasy find their way into the white experience of various other areas of Australia's social life. The book begins with a multi-ethnic rush of people seeking gold, all pictured on the first page in their various ethnic costumes. They come from all parts, by ship, horse, or train, and most were very poor when they went home again. But many found something more valued and true. At Christmas they brewed the Eureka stew. Stew cooking begins with Molly O'Drew giving 4 potatoes to her husband Blue, who peels them and throws them into a cauldron. But, as Molly O'Drew remarks, it wasn't much of a feast. In the meantime, 21 diggers sat hungry and tired, until Molly stepped into their midst and said, "I know a way we can all be fed. Put what you thought in the pot next to Blue, and together we'll make our Christmas stew." This leads to all sorts of ethnic characters arriving on the scene and adding to their stew their own ethnic-specific ingredients. As O'Malley roasts first with some spuds, then it was the ruds, turned into carrots that Blue chopped into pieces and bounced in the lot, making Taffy with leeks, and Nell with the turnip, and Old Hugh with some barley, and Leopold with some Brussels sprouts, Murray and Mazzini with some zucchini, Heinrich and Hans with some sauerkraut, Jacques with onions, Abdul with garlic, Wang the Chinese with a bag full of peas, and many others. And we even have, towards the end, of Johnny Barcoo joining in with yams and the tail of a red kangaroo. Finally, the last thing of all cast in by Blue. But just what it was, nobody knew. The opposition that structures the work, on its surface, is the classical opposition that structures the discourse of multicultural enrichment and valorization. The initial poverty of the Anglo-Celtic combination, not much of a feast, is contrasted by the richness of the diversity that ends up constituting the stew. In much the same way, the multicultural valorization of ethnic food, which stresses its enriching qualities in everyday discourse, is often contrasted with the supposed poverty of the Anglo-Celtic cultural tradition. The opposition which is maintained at the level of ingredients is not, however, maintained at the level of agency. And it is mainly at this level that the white nation fantasy that is engraved in the text begins to transpire. Crucially, while everyone throws their ingredients, one person is allowed a monopoly over cooking from the beginning of the story until its end. The white Australian Blue, even the patriarchy which would have otherwise structured the lives of a mining Anglo-Celtic couple, is forgotten for the sake of making the true Blue Aussie male the main will behind the whole process. Furthermore, whatever minimal agency the ethnics who put in their ingredients have, their will is the most activated following by a request by Molly Luckley. Molly thought of this, otherwise those ethnics would have kept on just sitting there and feeling tired and hungry. Here we come to one of the crucial elements of the discourse of valorization. Valuing requires someone to do the valuing and something to be evaluated. The discourse of enrichment operates by establishing a break between valuing negatively and valuing positively, similar to the break which the discourse of tolerance establishes between tolerance and intolerance. In much the same way, however, as the tolerance and intolerance divide mystifies the more important divide between holding the power to tolerate and not holding it, the distinction between valuing negatively and valuing positively mystifies the deeper position between holding the power to value negatively or positively and not holding it. Heidegger's critique of the discourse of value perfectly puts out the less than egalitarian assumptions underlying it. As he put it, it is important finally to realize that precisely through the characterization of something as value, what is so valued is robbed of its worth. That is, by the assessment of something as a value, what is valued is admitted only as an object of man's estimation. Every valuing, even when it values positively, is subjectivizing. It does not let things be. Rather, valuing lets things be valid. In context of Australian multiculturalism, the point being made is not simply the discourse of enrichment placed in the dominant culture in a more important position than other migrant cultures. More importantly, this discourse also assigns to migrant cultures a different mode of existence to Anglo-Celtic culture. While the dominant white culture merely and unquestionably exists, migrant cultures exist for the latter. Their value, or the viability of their presentation as far as white Australians are concerned, lies in their function as enriching cultures. It is in this sense that the notion of enrichment contributes to the position of non-white Anglo-Australians within the white nation fantasy. In the stew that grew, most of the migrants not only remained deprived of the capacity to contribute to the actual cooking process, but they were also voiceless. It is Blue who is given the task of declaring the relative value of each ingredient. "They sure look tasty," said Blue. "This is sure to be different." Blue's valorization takes a rather perverse turn when the Aboriginal Johnny Barcoo comes in with his yam and kangaroo tale. To Blue's exclamation, "Now there's the taste of Australia," said Blue. "That's sure to make a fair dinkum stew." If it isn't bad enough that the Aboriginal people have to wait for a posteriori declaration that they are the taste of Australia by a white Australian, judging from the pictures, they do not even stay around to eat from the stew. Their value is one of unperturbing enrichment, as if Blue and Molly were saying, "Thank you for enriching us with what can make our national cultural production distinctively Australian. Now please go back to your books so that we can enjoy being enriched without you annoying us with your presence." A real example of this disposition surfaced by an interview with a bank manager who recently moved to Mark. The interview began with him stating that the main reason behind his move to the area was to enjoy the cultural diversity the area has to offer. "It's the part of Sydney I've missed most." He had moved to Adelaide for a 3-year period. 10 minutes into the interview, however, the discussion moved to architecture and migrant housing, and he had this to say: "They, the migrants, have really ruined the place, haven't they?" For this person, there was no contradiction between migrants being enriched and them running the place, for their value derived from the services, not from inhabiting the area. Overall, while the stew that grew works as a valorization of the many ethnic ingredients of valuable ethnic objects which have helped make the stew, it also works to valorize Blue's capacity as a cook, an ode not only to the white Australian capacity of recognizing the value of ethnicity, but also, above all, the white Australian art of mixing. Ultimately, it is this art of mixing the ethnic ingredients thrown into the pot that Blue's contribution stands out. He does not contribute any ordinary ingredients to the stew. As far as his contribution is concerned, just what it was, nobody knows. Blue's contribution was something akin to what Christ injected into the basket of loaves and fishes to make them multiply. His contribution allowed the mix to work and expand. And it is precisely why it is the most valuable of all. Left to themselves, those ingredients would not have even mixed, let alone in this most memorable stew. To have a multicultural society with many cultures. Left to themselves, however, these cultures are not bound to mix, or at least not to mix properly without leading to ethnic tensions and wars. For the mix to work, it has to be guided by a white essence. That most valuable of all ingredients, the democratic tolerance, freedom of speech ingredient, that only the white aristocracy really knows how to throw into the Australian stew. Indeed, for the journalist Paul Sheehan, there is an enormous difference between the self-evident diversity of Australia's multiracial society and the big protective tent under which this diversity is thriving. Take away that big tent, Australian culture, and this diversity hurtles into state-sponsored tribal animosities. Or, As Northern Territory Premier Marshall Perrin less dramatically puts it, in our Western's knowledge, educational traditions and English as an international language are among the most valuable assets that we bring into our regional trading partnerships. We weave these attributes together with our liberal democratic traditions to help build our increasingly multiracial society together. However, the democratic spirit with the true blues of Australia can throw into a national stew is clearly not enough. It is merely the spirit that guides the mixer who still has to do the hard work of regulating the mix by controlling the measurements and diluting the concentrations. It is to this discourse of measuring and controlling the mix as it is present in the immigration debates that I will now turn to show the recurrent governmental white fantasy that propels getting the mix right, measurement and numbering pathology. In an argument titled How to Get the Mix Right, Professor Gavin Jones, the coordinator of the demography program at the Australian National University, wrote that Australia's immigration policy has contributed both to the substantial population growth and to the diversification of the population in terms of ethnic mix and geographic origins. Professor Jones, like all of those who wish to talk about immigration, laments the fact that one cannot talk about it without being labeled. And while some racists will seek to gain out of cloak with respectability by expressing concerns about social cohesion, one can express such concerns without being racist. Professor Jones himself, far from being racist, finds the whole situation at present quite amusing. These days, about 30,000 Asian immigrants enter each year, and although there are potential flashpoints, the modification of Australia's population composition has proceeded with a remarkable degree of calm. The increase in the ethnic Asian proportion of the Australian population, now 6% in my view, is of great benefit, not only in diversifying Australia's cuisine and culture, but in building close family and business links that will facilitate Australia's effective integration into the region. What makes Australia such a peaceful phenomenon, such a good stew, is precisely that we have a good mix. We are fortunate that there is no one dominant ethnic group among the migrants. All will not necessarily continue to build up. However, since ethnic tensions at home would hardly promote that very goal of effective integration in the region, there is also an ongoing need to promote and monitor community cohesion in Australia. You can see how the fantasy of the stew that grew was being replayed here. The whole construct operates as a fantasy space, staging the professor in the role of the white governmental cook. A cook happy with the way the stew is proceeding, but worried nevertheless. Worrying, as we have seen, is essential. For the white governmental subject wasn't worried that there would be no need for him to exist. Here, it is the professor's informed worry that helps him assert the necessity of the presence of his multiple governmental eye, demonstrated by the capacity to master the numbers. His worry is to ensure that the recipe is always followed. No one dominant ethnic group among migrants, or, of course, one dominant white group among non-migrants is not possible, since that group, imbued, unlike others, with democracy, tolerance, and the principle of freedom of speech, is, by its very essence, not predisposed to create ethnic tensions. It is only predisposed to solve them through numbering, measuring, and mixing. Such worries about mixing and mixtures are a constant feature of Australian media reporting about immigration and multiculturalism. 3 years before Jones's articles, some people had similar worries in celebration of the 10th anniversary of the famous "Are We Mixing Well?" speech made by the academic historian Geoffrey Blaine, a renowned worried mixer. In a newspaper article written by the reporter David Jenkins with the suitable measurement conscious title of "Quarter Asian Australia," Jenkins appeared very worried about the mix. What happened to the Asian front in the past decade? Have we become more or less tolerant towards Australia? Do people worry about the Asianization of Australia? Oh, If you look at the demographics supports that we have Asianized faster and more thoroughly than before, and that anyone, including Professor Blaney, could have anticipated in 1984. Today, the Asian percentage of the population has not only jumped significantly, it remains on the same curve. Can we carry it off? Can we rearrange the demographic mix without recreating the tensions one finds in much of Western Europe and North America? Although there appear to be so many Asians in Australia, Jenkins's U and V is, of course, Asianless. Who else but a white you and we can be seen to have the impression of seeing an Asian stay with them? If you walked down the street and saw someone who was ethnically Asian, that was the impression that stayed with you, whether the person was born here or not. Who else can worry about carrying it off, despite the Asians? And of course, who else can worry about the mix? Asians do not worry about the mix, they are the mix. Jenkins, however, is worried. There are signals that all is not well. The fact that members of the Vietnamese and Lebanese communities tend to concentrate in certain areas has given rise to concern that we are creating ghettos. In postcode 2166, Cambramatta, 83% of the people are overseas born or are the children of people born overseas. Through good management and good luck, Australia has faced many of the problems faced by other countries, and will continue to do so. Of course, nothing worries the mixer like the concentration. Like a lump of flour in the stew, it is the proof of either a substance resistant to mixing or a weakening of the mixer's capacity to mix. To back his worries, Jenkins provides us with the highest concentration of professorial regulators of the mix, all admitting views on how much is good, and all worried, of course. Professor Jamie Mackey says he is worried we might again be going a bit too fast on Asian migration and high unemployment. We only need one serious race riot and it will undo 30 years of good work. He always said the Irish used a key consideration that was the Australian community's capacity to absorb non-white immigrants without undue stress. In 1960, we thought the number should be about 1,500 Asians a year. Within 10 years, we were calmly absorbing about 10,000 without any problems at all, but I became uneasy later at the speed at which the numbers jumped from 24,000 Asians a year in about 1982 to 60,000 a year after the publication of the Fitzgerald Report in 1988. Given his credentials as a master governmental cook and a virtuoso numerologist, we, of course, should all understand the seriousness of the situation. Professor Mackey became a bit uneasy when the number jumped. The fascinating thing is to see how the white nation fantasy can give stage to a governmental nationalist capable of believing that their feeling uneasy is something that ought to worry the nation. Professor Viviani of Griffith University, on the other hand, is not feeling uneasy. She's reported to be just uncomfortable. I thought 140,000 was way too high in a period of rapid social change in Australia, she said. I'm more comfortable with something between 70,000 and 100,000. Some people do not express such sentiments, and they simply enact their governmental role by merely enumerating. For Dr. Price, the high priest of numerology, assuming a long-term advantage of 140,000 a year with the same ethnic composition as the net immigration of 1986 to 91, then in the year 2020, the ethnic strength of the Asian component would be some 4.03 million, total population of 24.66 million, that is 16.3%. Like Jenkins's in postcode 2166, Cambramatta, 83% of the people are overseas born or are the children of people born overseas. Just what these statistics reveal, other than the paranoid governmental desire that propels them, is unclear. Such enumeration definitely reaches pathological dimensions at times, such as in this newspaper article by Mark Llewellyn with the title, New things are up with the Joneses. A Vietnamese name is among the 10 longest listings in Telecom's new Sydney White Pages for the second year running. Nguyen, pronounced Nguyen, is the most common name in Vietnam and the 8th most common in Sydney's new telephone book. The name also recorded the biggest increase, with 218 more entries this year than in 1993. The National Marketing Manager of Telecom White Pages, Mr. Warwick James, said Telecom expected Nguyen to overtake Taylor and jump into 7th place by next year's edition. Only in Sydney and Melbourne is there such a challenge to the dominant Anglo-Saxon names, he said. The other names are pretty constant across the country. Again, this news item appears as if it was naturally made to be news. It is only so, however, from within a white fantasy of governmentality. Yet again, what one is supposed to glean from all this other than someone who has their worried eye on the telephone book is unclear. What is new? Should the Taylors worry? Should they start breeding? These questions are only relevant from within the fantasy that generates them. Reading this, however, I could not think of Keith Douglas, who is described by David Greason in I Was a Teenage Fascist. While away his ample spare time marking off Jewish-sounding names in the telephone dictionary, this way we'll know where they are when they take power completely. Here, the pathological governmentality between the innocent numerological exercises becomes less implicit. As all of the above intimates, this white multiculturalism, by being concerned with the acceptance, positioning, and numbering of otherness in order to maximize its value, is a practice that aims at creating and managing an economy of otherness, and assists in producing and regulating the value of otherness to maximize the homely feeling, the taste of the homemade stew of the white Australians positioned at its center. It is in this sense that white multiculturalism reveals itself as a white fantasy of national governmentality in the sense defined by Foucault. For, if the nationalist practices of the exclusion look like negative practices aimed only at the beheading of others, white multiculturalism appears as a process of fostering ethnic life and ethnic value. This process reaches its epitome during the period of the Keating Labour government and the rise of productive diversity. Productive diversity, the production of ethnic surplus value. The discourse of productive diversity emerged following the election of Bob Hawke's Labour government in 1983 and was part of right-wing Labour economic rationalism discourse. The discourse aimed, among other things, at justifying various economic and social policy interventions on the basis of economic soundness. It accompanied Hawke's inclusion of economic efficiency as a principle of multiculturalism. This marrying of cultural value with economic value was perfected by the Keating government. For Keating, multiculturalism constituted an economically exploitable resource in the form of hitherto untapped potential. The point was to create the social conditions at both a micro and macro level to allow such potential to become utilizable. It was believed that this would give Australia an advantage. It was much in need of competitive international environment. We have realized that our future depends on making ourselves relevant to the rest of the world. This was the chief function of productive diversity and what made it valuable. It was constructed as a key aspect, if not the key aspect, of the multicultural era issued in by Keating. There have been three distinct phases of Australia's post-war response to immigrants. The first phase was characterized by an expectation that immigrants would fit into the dominant Anglo-Australian culture. The second was characterized by the encouragement of tolerance and respect for diversity, and the effort to ensure access and equity regardless of ethnic origin. And this effort will continue. By now we have the beginning of the third phase. We must now take advantage of the potentially huge national economic asset which multiculturalism represents. This is what productive diversity is about. The distinctiveness of Keating's discourse of valorization was that it went beyond the dominant value of ethnic cultures at this level of consumption. It was an attempt at productive value. In the sphere of consumption, ethnic culture yielded for the white valorizer the cultural value embodied in it. To consume a Thai meal was to enjoy its cultural value, its Thainess, so to speak. With productive diversity, it was a question of activating ethnic cultures to make them yield not cultural satisfaction, but more cultural capital. In this sense, that one can receive it as a cultural exploitation of ethnicity to make it yield a kind of ethnic surplus value, it was a much clearer discourse of exploitation rather than consumption. This was precisely the theme of a famed conference on productive diversity in business, where the key discussed paper was prefaced by the author. It's not what you can do for them, but what they can do for you. The conference involved incredibly original directives in the mode in which one can use one's local ethics to make them yield their potential capacity to produce surplus. Thus, one of the charms of international travel is to experience different landscapes, different food. Australia needs to offer Australian experiences to visitors. In seeking to understand what qualifies about our country's appeal most to different nationalities, it is only necessary to ask immigrants from those countries for advice on the best way of selling aspects of their Australian identity to incoming tourists. Now, at one level, it is important, and an important one. There is clearly nothing wrong with its use. It can be seen as a further integration of ethnic difference in the mainstream of Australian society, and as such, another step on the road to further empowerment. The problem, however, is that, like multiculturalism in general and the discourse of valorization and tolerance in particular, there is no singular way in which this productive diversity is conceived. Also, judging from the statement emitted by those who are concerned by it, its dominant understanding constitutes an economic extension of the space of the white nation fantasy. The single most important indicator of the imaginary white governmental dominance that has structured the discourse of productive diversity and its inability to conceive of this diversity at any level other than the managed object. Diversity is always assumed to be a diversity among employees, among those who need to be managed, those who need to be employed. It is never conceived as a cultural diversity that needs to be ruled among employers, managers, and rulers. Those are free from any recommendations concerning their own diversity and how productive or unproductive it can be. Thus, the productive diversity in business discussion paper begins from a manager's point of view. The specific characteristics of the multicultural workforce are that of the employee. For Keating as well, the issue was straightforwardly a matter of the diversity of the workforce. Managing a culturally diverse workforce may not be perceived as a challenge by managers and business owners, many of whom think that their workforce is able to speak and communicate adequately in English. A management representative, Robert Pritchard, in a paper to the Productive Diversity in Business Conference, revealed the white management, a culturally diverse employee, this polarity revealed very clearly. The main message, and this to all young Australians, but most especially those whose cultural heritage is not Anglo-Saxon, is to develop your cultural and lingual abilities to the stage where it can be exploited by you and your chosen peers and utilized by your employer. The message in this for Australian employers is to invest in people with multicultural talents. The white managerial imaginary behind all this becomes even clearer as one notices that the same worry about numbers and concentrations is seen as a propeller behind the strategy. Thus, for another manager, Ivan Davidson, in his opening address to the conference, these challenges are, of course, a two-way challenge. We must continue to ensure that as a society we avoid the prejudice and resultant violence that has pervaded many countries. We must ensure that we continue to integrate as a people to avoid the ethnic ghettos. Why ethnic ghettos are unproductive diversity can only be answered within the white governmental imaginary that perceives them as a problem in the first place. Northern Territory Chief Minister Marshall Brown states that, however, we will never make the most of our opportunities in the region unless we learn Asian languages, become familiar with Asian history, geography, customs, and current events, and take in many more immigrants from the region to help us to do business with their countries of origin. There is nothing to fear in this. In this statement, Braun reveals that the fearing white governmental subject behind the whole concept. Indeed, if the addressee wasn't imagined to be a white Australian, why do we need to allay their fears at all? In a seminal report by Carmen Nyland towards managing diversity, you can see how the very language used works to disallow the possibility of thought moving from the valorized managing cultural diversity to the repressed idea of culturally diverse management. A managing diversity approach enables individual employees to be appreciated and valued. It begins by training managers to recognize the range of cultural differences that they have in their employees. Then it trains managers to tolerate and accommodate these differences, and eventually trains them to see these differences not as a deficit but as an advantage. You can see here how the discourses of multicultural tolerance and valorization used by conceiving of this tolerance as an interested mode of acceptance. This necessarily means that the object of tolerance cannot be seen in a purely negative term. Within this fantasy, it is because some benefits are derived from the objects of multicultural toleration, or at least from the act of toleration itself, that we tolerate them, go to the trouble of dominating them through tolerance, and accept them within our sphere of influence. Rather than involving a negative evaluation of its objects, tolerance is guided by a process of evaluating both the benefits accruing in the act of toleration and what is perceived as negative and needs to be endured. However, and this is what has been emphasized in this chapter, what is important is what defines the object of what multicultural tolerance is not that it is valued negatively or positively, but that it is constructed as an object of evaluation as such. It is because this evaluating process involves both the negative and the positive, what is appreciated and what needs to be endured, that the positioning of white multiculturalism's other and the setting of the boundaries within which it can exist are far more complex than a mere search for protection from negativity as it is constructed in nationalist practices of exclusion. While reviewing all the managerial statements of valorization in their totality, they add up to more than just a conception of polarity between the white national manager and non-white managerial objects. If we examine their actual impact in the social field from what they emanate, we realize that they actually help shape the very ground that makes them credible. They help to ward off the possibility of a non-white national manager. In this sense, the discourse of valorization raises an important issue regarding the relationship between the national fantasy of the white subject and the reality in which it is grown. For a fantasy to provide a solid basis for the construction of the white national self within it, it has to be well grounded in social reality. And such fantasies are not the products of the wild imagination. To work efficiently as fantasies, to provide a relatively stable home for those who inhabit them, they have to support and be supported by the practical reality lived by the subject. If we have seen in the previous chapters, this practical reality has to be seen lacking in comparison to the fantasy. Otherwise, a nationalist would not derive any existential purpose from being a positionalist. At the same time, this relative lack cannot be too great or the fantasy becomes unattainable. Fantasy of the white manager is grounded in a simple reality where non-white Australians are clearly underrepresented in the political, social, and economic managerial class. It is this reality that gives credibility to the white Australian that positions himself or herself in the role of valorizing fixing it. At the same time, there are clearly tendencies in Australian society for non-white Australians to assert themselves as equally empowered, Australian national wills within the field. This is the reality that cannot be incorporated by white multiculturalism and multiculturalism. Every fantasy has its role. It is that part of the subject's practical reality whose acknowledgement can lead to endangering the known coherence and stability that the fantasy needs in order to reproduce itself. This realism is a necessary result of the complex relationship between fantasy and practical reality outlined above. It is also why a fantasy does not merely represent social reality, but also tries to shape it practically, in order efficiently to contain the changes that cannot be incorporated within. It is important to stress that containment does not mean exclusion. It involves a far more complex process of positioning. Let us look, for example, at the growing presence of the confidently Australian but non-white nationalists among the migrant population. Because it is part of an Australian reality that undermines the national subject, national object, white nationalist, third world-looking migrant, tolerated, enriched, enriching set of relations that underlie the fantasy, it is a reality that the practice is emanating from within the white multiculturalism aimed to contain. What makes such a containment a complex process, however, is that white multiculturalism sees in the migrant an enriching, tolerable presence, and therefore something exploitable that has to be included in the national space. That is, such practices of containment cannot turn into practices of exclusion and aim at regulating the modality of inclusion of the third world living migrants in a national space instead. This makes a far more complex spatial practice. It is an art of positioning which has its roots in the modes of regulating the presence of migrant labor to exploit it economically when such migrant labor was the dominant form of migration to Australia and, indeed, the world. The practical logic of white multiculturalism on the dialect of inclusion and exclusion. As has often been pointed out, the history of the post-World War II wave of migration into Australia is essentially a history of global migration. The development of Australian capitalism following the war was accomplished by the help of an influx of workers from overseas imported by the state to meet local labor shortages. Employers gained directly, at least in the short term, from the presence of migrant labor. First, they gained from the mere presence as labor given existing shortages. Secondly, and more specifically, they gained from their presence as migrant labor. The migrant workers, unlike the local workers, were unintegrated in society and institutions. They could be subjected to highly exploitative working conditions, working often without offering more than occasional, often individual resistance. The reason behind this, of course, lay their relative lack of social power emanating from their position as workers, from their inability to communicate in the dominant language, and from the weakness of their eventual organized labor movements which stood after white workers and perceived migrant labor as a threat to white working conditions. The relative marginalization of migrant labor was epitomized by the European guest worker system as a set of mechanisms and rules which maintained the foreignness of the migrant worker while physically entrenching them as a structural component of production in the economy. The guest worker system was chiefly a process aimed at maximizing the exploitation of migrant labor. It put in place mechanisms through which migrants had to be physically positioned inside the nation, but at the same time also had to be symbolically within it. It is those mechanisms which laid the ground for the peculiar position of migrant labor in these early periods of high exploitation. Insofar as employers needed migrant workers to work in their factories, they wanted them included in national space. For these employers, however, the desirability of this inclusion lay precisely in the migrant workers being socially excluded. The distinctiveness of the migrant workers' position in this process is that while they were subjected to certain processes which affect the marginalization and exclusion, these processes did not aim to marginalize to the point where they were driven outside social space as was the cause of many Aborigines. For example, the exclusion of migrant labor was not total, since obviously its aim was not to drive them outside social space, but to drive them to the point where it was precisely their inclusion as cheap labor that became viable. Thus, paradoxically, it is precisely the interest in their inclusion that activated the existing social processes of their exclusion, while at the same time setting limits on how far the margin of society they ultimately excluded. Far from being mechanisms of exclusion, these processes activated a complex dialectic of inclusion and exclusion where cheap labor was positioned in a liminal space created by centripetal and centrifugal forces which activated each other. It was the very need for inclusion that activated exclusionary processes, while it was the exclusionary force that allowed for the inclusionary ones to be activated. It is often thought paradoxical, for example, how the virulent anti-immigration discourse that is dominant in California today is accompanied by an increase in the number of illegal Mexican immigrant laborers crossing the border. In fact, the two have been seen as complementary processes. The anti-immigration discourse, by continually constructing the immigrants as unwanted, works precisely at maintaining their economic viability to American employers. They are best wanted on the other hand. Female labor in Australia and elsewhere in the West is increasingly subjected to a similar dialectic. It is often assumed that the reemergence of ideologies that aim to reposition women in the traditional role within the domestic sphere contradict the fact that a greater proportion of women are entering the workforce relative to the number of men. In fact, far from being contradictory, this discourse operates to give this labor a marginal value, such that it remains attractive from the point of view of the employer of this labor. Far from somehow sending women back into the domestic sphere, its main effect is to continue the prism through which female labor is devalued. The social devaluation of their labor is a part of the process of constructing its economic value for the employer. It is this dialectic of inclusion and the exclusion that constitutes the modus operandi that technologies put in place to contain the multicultural wheel through the positioning of the third world within. In his work on domestication, Dr. de Saint-Hilaire, the famous French naturalist, analyzes the different processes of domesticating and exploiting a specific type of llama, whose wool was only available of good quality when it remained in the wild. As soon as it was included permanently in human settlement, the quality of the llama's wool deteriorated. Thus, the problem from the domesticator's point of view was that once domesticated, once included in human settlement, the llama lost the value for which it was domesticated in the first place. Its value lied in being able to exclude it. At the same time, it could not be totally driven to the wild as a student its wool could not be exploited. Thus, the problem was maintaining an in-between space where it could be neither totally included nor totally excluded. De Saint-Hilaire gives us a further insight into this dialectic of inclusion and exclusion by pointing out that it aims in what he calls la sauvagerie de la sauvagerie. How does one tame make less savage something with a value which lies in its savageness, and its non-belonging to humanly defined sphere, without threatening this very savageness? To De Saint-Hilaire, one needs to develop techniques aimed at safeguarding the savage state. This appears contradictory at first, for any savageness that is safeguarded is no longer truly savage. What Saint-Hilaire's analysis emphasizes, however, is that the savageness that is needed is not the savageness of the llama's will, but the savageness of its woolly body. The techniques aimed at safeguarding the savage state are precisely those techniques which can maintain the savageness of the body, which is where the value of the domesticated other lies. While eradicating the savage which stands between the domesticator and the exploitable body. As we have seen in examining white multiculturalism, it is precisely the eradication of the migrant that continues the very basis of the white Australian capacity for tolerance and acceptance. As such, white multiculturalism activates dialectic of inclusion and exclusion similarly to the above, in order to position third world working migrants in the permanent spatial industry where their will is excluded, while the exploitable savage body and culture is influenced. This constitutes the essence of the technologies aimed at the containment of the multicultural view, and which have been chiefly present in the settlement processes of the Western Australian state. The closest to dialectic inclusion and exclusion in Australia came to resemble its modes of operation under the European guest worker system was under the policy of assimilation. The migrant workers were at their weakest. Undoubtedly, the resemblance is limited given that even under the policy of assimilation, Australian migrants have had full formal legal, political, and social security rights after a relatively short period of residency. Nevertheless, the effect of the assimilation policy was similar to the guest worker system, in that it positioned the migrant workers in a process of near economic inclusion in the workplace of socio-political exclusion, both in the workplace and elsewhere in society. As I argued in Chapter 2, the big effect of the prevalence of the ideology of assimilation is in fact exclusionary for non-white migrants in the socio-political spheres of society. It only served as a system of classification through which the accusatory category non-assimilated served to construct and reproduce the tenuous nature of the migrant inclusion within the nation. This category did not only indicate the division of the populace in the two sections, one seemed essentially assimilated and the other one as marginally unassimilated. More importantly, it is also constructed non-assimilation such that it empowered the assimilated a negative problematic group and actively to exclude them from the social, political, and cultural spheres of society. To use the same polarity, they say that the policy of assimilation operated as a technology aimed at constructing the migrants to perpetuate internal savage. While state multiculturalism distinguishes itself from preceding settlement policies and the extent between compared social cultural spaces opened up by the state for non-white Australians, it was nevertheless a refining of the processes through which settlement policy regulated the dialectic of inclusion and exclusion. This is most clearly embodied in the notions of enrichment, tolerance, and acceptance examined in this chapter. Indeed, in the way they promote an open arms approach to the non-white Australian population, only to reposition it as potentially less valuable, these categories were a reflection of the dialectic inclusion and exclusion. One further distinctive feature of the white multiculturalism of the state is the way it opens up cultural spaces of inclusion as a substitute to effective inclusion within these political processes. The closest the non-white middle classes come to political participation with closed circles of welfare politics, or more precisely, the politics of regulating and distributing multicultural welfare funds made available by the white state. The very nature of this political involvement reproduced the paradigm of tolerance and acceptance by promoting the conception of multiculturalism as something granted, a kindness, while Australians in which were good enough to engage. As can be seen, the dialectic of inclusion and exclusion at work within white multiculturalism constantly works at laying the practical grounds on which it can sustain itself as a white fantasy. It also lays the material foundation for the fundamental ambivalence that is constituted of the white multicultural gaze towards the abstract. Conclusion. In his much referred to work on cultural diversity, the philosopher Charles Taylor defines multiculturalism as involving the demand that we all recognize the equal value of different cultures, that we not only let them survive but acknowledge their worth. For all its sophistication, Taylor's approach exemplifies the right multiculturalism that we have examined in this chapter. This aspect of Taylor's argument is criticized by Susan Wolf, who points out that the individual of the issue is well beyond the question of acknowledging its worth. More importantly, it rests on the claim that African or Asian or Native American cultures are part of our culture, or rather the cultures of some group that constitute our community. Criticizing the idea that multiculturalism is an invitation to recognize, for example, the equal value of the literary works of the other cultures present in the United States, he argues that the most significant harm to which the previous failures of recognition at our libraries contributed was not that we were deprived of access to some great folk tales as great or even greater than the ones represented on the shelves. Most significantly good, it is not that our stock of legends is now better or more comprehensive than before. It is rather that having these books in our reading room, we come to recognize ourselves as a multicultural community, and so to recognize and respect the members of that community in all our diversity. It is this recognition that we are a multicultural community in all our diversity that is evaded by white multiculturalism. For it is the opposition between valuing diversity and being diverse that the white nation fantasy operates to reproduce itself. We appreciate diversity, we value ethnic contributions, etc. attitudes about which abound in the dominant political discourses in Australia create a gulf between the we and that which is appreciated and valued. In doing so, they work to mystify the real possibility grounded in the very composition of Australian society, of a national we, which is itself diverse. It is this we that is the core of the multicultural real. We are diversity. It is a we associated with the verb to be. Well, it is the verb to have, which always presupposes a subject that has and an object that is had, that structures the imaginary of white multiculturalism. Indeed, to have others is a necessary precondition for appreciating them. To have and to be are both what Benveniste calls verbs d'etat, verbs delineating a state of being. However, Benveniste asserts in a complex argument that one needs to read in full to capture its strength, that while they both indicate a state of being, they don't indicate the state of being. To be, the state of that who is being, the one who is something. To have is the state of possessor, the one for whom something is. The difference appears thus. Between the two terms, it joins to be established an intrinsic relation of identity. It is the consubstantial state of being. On the contrary, the two terms joined together have to remain distinct. It is the relation between the possessor and the possessed. This is the crucial difference between multiculturalism of being and the multiculturalism of having. While the former establishes a unified Australian we, where whites and non-whites fuse in a consubstantial state of being, the latter always establishes an extrinsic relation between a white possessor and a non-white possessed. The white multicultural we, which appreciates diversity, seems continuous within the old Australian we that did not appreciate it. Diversity simply does not affect the nature of the white we, but remains extrinsic to it. It is in this sense that white multiculturalism's to have is set against the verb to be. For if we are diversity, there would be nothing to appreciate and value other than ourselves. This is the difficult imagery domain of the multicultural real.